The atmosphere inside diplomatic circles shifted dramatically the moment news broke that the delegation from the United States had abruptly departed from Geneva without signing any agreement. For weeks, expectations had been carefully built around what many analysts called a last chance negotiation, a high-stakes attempt to stabilize rising geopolitical tensions and prevent another escalation that could reshape global alliances. Diplomats, journalists, and policy observers gathered outside conference halls believed a breakthrough was close. Instead, silence followed. Then confirmation that talks had collapsed. The sudden exit triggered immediate speculation. Was this a calculated strategy, a diplomatic warning, or proof that negotiations had reached an irreversible deadlock? Behind closed doors, representatives had been meeting under frameworks connected to institutions like the United Nations, where neutral ground often allows rival powers to speak without public pressure. Geneva has long symbolized cautious optimism in global diplomacy, a city where enemies shake hands even when trust is thin. This time, however, the tone reportedly changed during the final hours. Sources suggested disagreements were no longer about technical details, but about fundamental security guarantees and long-term commitments. Negotiations moved from constructive debate to hardened positions, and once that happens in diplomacy, progress can unravel quickly. At the heart of the dispute were competing visions of regional stability. Washington's negotiators allegedly pushed for stricter verification mechanisms and timelines, arguing that past agreements failed because enforcement lacked clarity. Other participants viewed those demands as excessive leverage rather than compromise. Delegates connected to the European Union attempted to bridge differences, proposing phased concessions designed to allow both sides to claim victory domestically. Yet compromise requires political room at home, and insiders hinted that none of the major players possessed enough flexibility to retreat without appearing weak. Observers quickly noticed that the walkout did not appear chaotic. Instead, it seemed carefully coordinated. Vehicles were prepared, statements drafted, and officials avoided direct confrontation with reporters. This suggested the decision to leave may have been made hours, perhaps days, earlier. In diplomatic language, leaving the table can sometimes be more powerful than staying. By exiting negotiations publicly, a country signals dissatisfaction while shifting pressure onto the opposing side. Analysts began debating whether the move was intended to reset talks under new conditions or to demonstrate that patience had run out. The negotiations also unfolded against a wider geopolitical backdrop, shaped by competition among global powers. Both China and Russia had closely monitored the discussions, each with strategic interests tied to the outcome. Their diplomats reportedly favored gradual compromise, wary that failure could intensify economic instability or trigger new sanction cycles, affecting global markets. Energy prices, shipping routes, and financial systems all hung indirectly in the balance, turning what appeared to be a regional dispute into a matter of worldwide concern. Central to the tension was the unresolved issue involving Iran, whose role in the negotiations remained both critical and controversial. For years, diplomatic engagement with Tehran has followed a familiar pattern: cautious optimism followed by sudden breakdowns. Supporters of continued dialogue argue that negotiations remain the only realistic path to preventing confrontation, while critics insist repeated agreements have failed to change long-term behavior. This divide shaped nearly every conversation in Geneva, creating an environment where even small disagreements carried enormous symbolic weight. Another factor, often overlooked by the public, is timing. Political calendars matter deeply in diplomacy. Elections, domestic economic pressures, and shifting public opinion influence how far leaders can compromise abroad. Officials from multiple delegations faced growing scrutiny back home, where opponents framed concessions as weakness. As deadlines approached, negotiators reportedly hardened their positions, fearing backlash more than diplomatic failure. In such circumstances, talks can collapse not because solutions are impossible, but because political risk becomes too high. The host nation, Switzerland, maintained its traditional neutrality, emphasizing that dialogue channels remained open despite the departure. Swiss mediators quietly encouraged informal back-channel discussions, even after the official sessions ended. Historically, many major agreements have emerged only after apparent failure, when public pressure fades and negotiators regain flexibility away from cameras. Some experts therefore warned against interpreting the walkout as the definitive end of diplomacy. Instead, it might represent a transition into a less visible phase. Markets reacted almost immediately. Investors interpreted the failed talks as a sign of prolonged uncertainty, causing fluctuations in energy and defense sectors. Political commentators began discussing worst-case scenarios, while military analysts examined whether increased regional deployments might follow. Yet experienced diplomats urged caution, reminding audiences that negotiation breakdowns often serve strategic purposes. Walking away can force reassessment, allowing each side to measure international reaction before deciding its next move. Perhaps the most important question now is not why the delegation left, but what message the departure was meant to send. Diplomacy operates through signals as much as agreements. By leaving without a deal, Washington may be attempting to redefine the negotiating framework, pushing rivals to reconsider assumptions about urgency and leverage. Alternatively, the move could reflect internal divisions that made compromise impossible at this stage. Until officials release fuller details, uncertainty will continue shaping global narratives. As the lights dimmed in Geneva's conference halls and delegations dispersed, one reality became clear. The negotiations were never just about a single agreement. They represented a test of whether major powers can still cooperate in an era defined by mistrust and strategic rivalry. The final countdown referenced by commentators may not signal the end of diplomacy, but rather the beginning of a more intense phase, one where every decision carries higher stakes and fewer opportunities for error. For now, the world watches closely, waiting to see whether the next move will bring renewed dialogue or deepen the divide that forced negotiators to walk away in the first place. Following the dramatic departure of the United States delegation from Geneva, global analysts immediately began dissecting the implications. What had initially appeared as a single, isolated incident now seemed like a signal of deeper fractures in international diplomacy. The walkout highlighted not only unresolved disagreements over verification mechanisms and security guarantees, but also underlying shifts in strategic priorities among major powers. Each delegation, it seemed, was attempting to recalibrate its position in a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape, balancing domestic pressures with global commitments. Political insiders described the scene in Geneva as tense, with delegations from the European Union, China, Russia, and regional stakeholders scrambling to understand the motives behind the sudden exit. Was it a calculated maneuver to extract concessions elsewhere? A warning shot aimed at Tehran? Or simply an acknowledgement that compromise had become politically impossible? Each interpretation carried significant consequences for both regional stability and the global order. Diplomatic channels buzzed with activity as back-channel communications intensified, attempting to prevent a complete breakdown in dialogue. The Iranian dimension remained central to the drama. Iran's position in Geneva negotiations has always been fraught with tension as it balances its domestic imperatives with external pressures. Officials in Tehran reportedly faced conflicting priorities, maintaining sovereignty while avoiding economic strangulation, projecting strength while showing willingness to engage. Analysts suggested that internal political factions in Iran had diverging views on how far to compromise, creating friction even within their own delegation. This internal tension added complexity to the already delicate negotiations, as every statement and gesture was scrutinized by international observers for signs of flexibility or intransigence. For Washington, the stakes were equally high. The United States government had long emphasized that any agreement must include enforceable safeguards to ensure compliance. Officials reportedly argued that previous agreements had failed due to vague language and lax verification, leaving loopholes that could be exploited. By leaving Geneva, the delegation signaled that these conditions remained non-negotiable. However, the move also carried domestic risk. Critics immediately questioned whether walking away constituted diplomatic failure or a strategic gamble designed to pressure other parties. In the hyperpartisan environment of domestic politics, perception often matters as much as policy, and the timing of the departure raised eyebrows in both legislative chambers. Meanwhile, European mediators found themselves in a precarious position. The European Union's diplomats had worked tirelessly to maintain momentum in negotiations, offering phased compromises and attempting to bridge the gap between Washington and Tehran. These efforts highlighted a recurring challenge in multilateral diplomacy, the need to maintain credibility with multiple audiences simultaneously. European officials were expected to project neutrality, foster cooperation, and secure tangible progress, all while navigating the divergent agendas of powerful allies and regional actors. When the U.S. delegation left, these efforts were abruptly complicated, forcing mediators to reassess both their strategy and messaging. At a broader level, the collapse of the Geneva talks underscored a growing trend in international relations. The increased influence of domestic politics on foreign policy. Leaders and delegations are no longer negotiating solely with each other. They must also negotiate with domestic audiences, political rivals, and the media. In countries with high-stakes elections or polarized public opinion, even minor concessions abroad can be portrayed as capitulation at home. This dynamic intensifies pressure on negotiators, reducing flexibility and making compromise increasingly difficult. In Geneva, the convergence of these pressures created an environment in which walking away became a plausible strategy rather than a mere last resort. Global markets reacted swiftly to the news. Energy stocks, particularly in oil and natural gas, saw immediate fluctuations as traders anticipated potential disruptions in supply chains and sanctions. Analysts highlighted the ripple effects. Commodity prices, currency stability, and defense industry projections were all indirectly impacted. While some market observers cautioned that such reactions might be temporary, The volatility highlighted the interconnected nature of modern geopolitics. A diplomatic deadlock in one city could reverberate across continents, affecting economies far removed from the negotiation table. Military analysts also weighed in, noting that the absence of an agreement could alter strategic calculations. Without a clear framework to manage tensions, countries might feel compelled to reinforce their defensive postures or accelerate military readiness programs. While direct confrontation was not imminent, analysts warned that miscommunication or misinterpretation of intentions could trigger dangerous escalation. In this sense, the walkout was not simply a symbolic gesture, it had tangible implications for regional and global security planning. Observers noted that timing played a critical role in the Geneva outcome. Diplomatic negotiations are rarely static. They're influenced by calendars, economic cycles, political transitions, and external crises. For example, approaching elections in multiple countries may have constrained negotiators, limiting their ability to offer concessions that might be unpopular with voters. Similarly, economic pressures, such as inflation, unemployment, and sanctions impact, shape how far a delegation can compromise. These timing-related constraints often determine whether a deal is achievable or whether talks stall, and Geneva appeared to reflect precisely this tension between urgency and political caution. A subtler aspect of the breakdown involved perceptions of credibility and trust. Diplomacy relies on both formal agreements and informal assurances, promises, gestures, and signals that indicate commitment. Reports suggested that mistrust had grown over the course of negotiations, with delegations questioning not only each other's intentions, but also the reliability of previous commitments. In such an atmosphere, even minor missteps can derail progress. The U.S. departure, therefore, was not only a reaction to specific disagreements, but also a manifestation of deeper skepticism about the viability of negotiation in the current context. The media played its own role in shaping perceptions. International coverage framed the walkout in various ways. Some emphasized U.S. assertiveness, others highlighted Tehran's resilience, and still others focused on the fragility of multilateral diplomacy. This media narrative further complicated the environment for negotiators, as each side became acutely aware of how statements and actions would be interpreted by global audiences. In high-stakes negotiations, public perception can be as powerful as the agreements themselves, influencing not only domestic support, but also international legitimacy. Despite the apparent impasse, some diplomats remained cautiously optimistic about the future. Historical precedent demonstrates that major agreements often emerge from moments of apparent failure. When negotiators step away, it can provide space for reflection, recalibration, and strategy adjustment. Informal backchannels, quiet consultations, and low-profile meetings can lay the groundwork for renewed talks under conditions more conducive to compromise. In this light, Geneva may represent not the end, but a critical inflection point in the broader diplomatic trajectory. As analysts continued to evaluate the implications, one recurring theme emerged: the intersection of strategy, signaling, and timing in modern diplomacy. Every action, from public statements to tactical withdrawals, carries layered meaning. Walking away from Geneva sent a clear signal of dissatisfaction while simultaneously creating leverage. It forced all stakeholders, regional powers, global competitors, and domestic constituencies to reassess priorities, expectations, and risk tolerance. In an era where information travels instantly and perception often shapes policy, this maneuver may be as influential as any formal agreement. Ultimately, the Geneva episode underscores a sobering reality. Diplomacy in the 21st century is as much about navigating perception, political constraints, and strategic signaling as it is about negotiating concrete terms. The withdrawal of the U.S. delegation, dramatic as it was, reflects the complex interplay of interests, pressures, and calculations that define modern international relations. While the world watches for what comes next, Geneva stands as a reminder that even when talks collapse, diplomacy does not end. It simply evolves, sometimes in ways that are far less visible but no less consequential. The coming weeks will determine whether the walkout becomes a prelude to renewed engagement or the opening chapter of prolonged stalemate. Will back-channel negotiations succeed in rekindling dialogue? Can mediators, particularly from the European Union and Switzerland, restore trust between deeply skeptical parties? Or will the departure mark a turning point where political constraints and strategic rivalries harden into long-term deadlock? The answers remain uncertain, but one thing is clear. Geneva, in its role as the epicenter of high-stakes diplomacy, has once again proven that the line between success and failure is razor-thin, and that every action, including walking away, carries weight far beyond the negotiation room. As the dust settled over Geneva following the abrupt exit of the United States delegation, international attention began shifting from immediate shock to strategic analysis. Observers across diplomatic, political, and economic spheres sought to understand the broader implications of the walkout, attempting to answer a crucial question. What does this event reveal about the current state of global negotiations? and how might it reshape future diplomatic efforts? The consensus was that the Geneva talks were never merely about a single agreement. They were a reflection of an increasingly complex, multipolar world where alliances, rivalries, and domestic pressures intersect in unpredictable ways. One of the immediate concerns centered on the message sent to regional actors. The Middle East, already volatile, became the focal point of speculation as experts considered the consequences of a failed negotiation. Iran, in particular, was seen as both a central player and a test case for the limits of international engagement. Tehran's internal factions reportedly interpreted the U.S. departure in contrasting ways. Hardline elements viewed it as validation that compromise with Washington was untenable, reinforcing narratives of external hostility. Meanwhile, moderates feared the setback would delay economic relief and strategic stability, potentially undermining their position within domestic politics. The resulting internal debate in Tehran, insiders suggested, would directly influence the country's next diplomatic moves and its willingness to engage in future talks. Beyond Iran, regional neighbors watched with equal intensity. Countries in the Gulf, North Africa, and South Asia were attuned to shifts in both security calculations and economic expectations. Analysts noted that instability in the region could ripple outward, affecting trade routes, energy prices, and regional defense postures. For smaller nations, the Geneva fallout underscored a stark reality. The policies and decisions of global powers can dictate the trajectory of regional security and economic stability. As such, many governments quietly began contingency planning, evaluating scenarios ranging from prolonged sanctions to potential military escalations, all while preparing to navigate a rapidly changing diplomatic landscape. The broader geopolitical implications were also significant. Major powers like China and Russia had been closely monitoring Geneva, each with vested interests in the outcome. Beijing's strategy, according to analysts, focused on maintaining influence without overtly antagonizing any party, aiming to position itself as a stabilizing force while simultaneously safeguarding economic and strategic objectives. Moscow, conversely, appeared to view the breakdown as a potential opportunity to assert its regional influence, leveraging tensions to strengthen alliances and negotiate from a position of perceived advantage. In this context, the U.S. departure did not occur in isolation. It intersected with broader strategic contests that extend far beyond the walls of Geneva's conference halls. At the heart of these dynamics lay the challenge of trust, a perennial issue in international negotiations. Diplomacy relies not only on written agreements, but also on unspoken understandings, confidence-building measures, and the credibility of commitments. In Geneva, trust had eroded incrementally. Delegations reportedly questioned the intentions and reliability of their counterparts, and historical grievances compounded the difficulty of reaching consensus. For Washington, the walkout was framed as a principled stance, emphasizing the importance of enforceable safeguards and long-term accountability. Yet the symbolic act of leaving the table carried additional weight, signaling to all parties, allies and rivals alike, that certain thresholds had been crossed and that further engagement would require recalibrated expectations. Timing also played a crucial role. Diplomacy does not occur in a vacuum. It is inseparably linked to domestic political cycles, economic pressures, and global events in the U.S. Our officials faced mounting scrutiny from both Congress and public opinion, with critics questioning the efficacy of negotiation strategies and supporters emphasizing the need for firm stances. In Iran, economic challenges, political factions, and social unrest influenced the latitude negotiators could exercise. Similarly, European mediators, balancing the interests of multiple member states, navigated pressures that range from fiscal accountability to public sentiment regarding security cooperation. These temporal dynamics meant that compromises acceptable yesterday might become politically unviable today, further complicating the Geneva calculus. The media's role in shaping public perception and international interpretation cannot be overstated. Coverage across multiple platforms amplified every nuance, from body language in conference rooms to the timing of statements. In modern diplomacy, where instantaneous communication shapes both public and governmental reaction, managing narrative becomes nearly as important as managing the negotiation itself. Analysts observed that media framing of the U.S. exit had immediate consequences. Allies sought reassurance, rivals tested boundaries, and markets reacted to perceived instability. The media's lens not only documented events, but also influenced the trajectory of subsequent diplomatic engagements. Economic dimensions were equally pressing. Analysts warned that the failure to secure an agreement could exacerbate financial uncertainty, affecting sectors from energy to defense, as well as global supply chains. Investors reacted swiftly, recalibrating portfolios in response to both short-term volatility and long-term risk assessments. Policy think tanks highlighted potential ramifications for sanctions regimes, trade negotiations, and investment flows, suggesting that the impact of Geneva's collapse would extend far beyond immediate political fallout. This economic dimension underscored a critical point. Diplomacy and global markets are increasingly intertwined, with each influencing the other in real time. Military and strategic considerations also gain prominence. Without a clear framework for managing disputes, regional powers might feel compelled to reinforce defensive postures, modernize arsenals, or reallocate resources. Analysts emphasize that escalation does not always manifest as open conflict. Even minor adjustments in military readiness or alliances can signal intent and influence negotiations indirectly. The Geneva deadlock thus had tangible security implications, highlighting the complex interplay between diplomatic negotiations and strategic planning in an interconnected world. Despite the apparent setback, some diplomats retained cautious optimism. Historical precedents illustrate that significant agreements often emerge from periods of apparent failure. Back-channel communications, informal consultations, and low-profile engagements frequently lay the groundwork for breakthroughs once public attention diminishes and political pressures ease. In this context, Geneva may have represented a temporary pause rather than a definitive end. Skilled mediators recognize the potential to convert a public setback into strategic leverage, reshaping the negotiation environment in ways not immediately visible to the global audience. Central to the discussion of Geneva's significance was the broader question of international norms and rules-based order. The breakdown of negotiations raised concerns about the erosion of diplomatic mechanisms designed to prevent conflict, mediate disputes, and establish accountability. Analysts warned that repeated failures could weaken faith in multilateral institutions, encouraging unilateral approaches and heightening the risk of regional instability. Conversely, a carefully managed return to negotiations could reinforce norms, demonstrating the resilience of diplomacy even under extreme pressure. This tension between collapse and continuity shaped much of the post-Geneva discourse, influencing both immediate responses and long-term strategies. In examining the U.S. decision to leave, experts highlighted the role of signaling in high-stakes diplomacy. Walking away, while disruptive, is a potent communication tool. It conveys dissatisfaction, asserts standards, and exerts pressure on counterparts to reconsider positions. In Geneva, the departure served multiple purposes: reaffirming core demands, signaling constraints to allies and adversaries, and setting conditions for potential re-engagement. The strategic logic of this approach relies on perception management, the careful calibration of intent, timing, and messaging to achieve desired outcomes without triggering unintended escalation. As analysts continued to evaluate the situation, a recurring theme emerged: the interconnectedness of modern diplomacy, domestic politics, and global strategy. Decisions taken in conference rooms ripple across nations, affecting economic stability, security calculations, and public perception. Each action, from subtle gestures to dramatic withdrawals, carries implications that extend far beyond the immediate context. Geneva's events illustrated this vividly, highlighting the multidimensional nature of negotiation and the high stakes inherent in even brief interruptions of dialogue. Ultimately, the Geneva episode reinforced a sobering reality. Diplomacy is rarely linear or predictable. It involves the continuous negotiation of interests, the management of perception, and the navigation of both visible and invisible pressures. The U.S. walkout, dramatic as it was, reflected not failure but the complexity of aligning multiple, often competing factors in a rapidly changing global landscape. While the world may initially interpret such events as setbacks, experienced observers recognize that strategic pauses can create opportunities, reset expectations, and prepare the ground for more durable solutions. Looking ahead, the key question remained whether Geneva would become a catalyst for renewed engagement or the beginning of a protracted stalemate. Back-channel diplomacy, regional consultations, and multilateral forums were expected to play a decisive role in shaping the next phase. Analysts emphasized the importance of patience, strategic vision, and adaptive negotiation tactics. Success would require balancing domestic imperatives with international responsibilities, aligning short-term actions with long-term objectives, and navigating an environment characterized by both uncertainty and opportunity. In conclusion, the aftermath of Geneva underscored the intricacies of 21st century diplomacy, revealing the delicate balance between negotiation, perception, and strategic interest. The departure of the U.S. Delegation was a dramatic moment, but it was far from a definitive end. Instead, it signaled a transition, a moment in which stakeholders must reassess priorities, evaluate strategies, and determine the most effective path forward. The world continues to watch closely, aware that in diplomacy, as in strategy, timing, signaling, and foresight, often determine outcomes as much as the content of agreements themselves. The aftermath of the U.S. walkout in Geneva left diplomats, policymakers, and international observers grappling with a complex mixture of disappointment and cautious calculation. While the immediate news cycle had been dominated by dramatic images and statements, a deeper analysis revealed a web of interconnected dynamics that extended far beyond the walls of the conference center. At the core of the issue was the reality that modern diplomacy operates in an environment shaped by competing interests, domestic political pressures, historical grievances, and global strategic calculations. Understanding the fallout required examining not only the surface-level disagreements, but also the underlying currents that define contemporary international engagement. One of the most pressing concerns following the Geneva breakdown was the impact on regional stability in the Middle East. Iran, already navigating a precarious balance of internal politics, economic pressures, and strategic positioning, faced intensified scrutiny. Hardline factions within Tehran viewed the U.S. departure as confirmation of a hostile approach, strengthening calls for a more assertive foreign policy. Conversely, moderate voices warned that failure to maintain engagement could exacerbate economic hardships and erode international credibility, potentially undermining their influence domestically. This internal tug-of-war, compounded by decades of geopolitical friction, made it exceedingly difficult for the Iranian delegation to chart a coherent strategy while under the intense gaze of both domestic and international audiences. The surrounding regional powers also reacted swiftly to the news. Gulf states, particularly those with direct strategic interests in Iran's policies, faced an urgent need to reassess security arrangements and economic plans. Analysts highlighted the vulnerability of global energy markets to perceived instability in the region, noting that even temporary disruptions could produce ripple effects on global commodity prices. Similarly, neighboring countries weighed the implications for defense postures and bilateral alliances, recognizing that a failure to stabilize key diplomatic engagements could compel them to act independently or adjust their strategic calculations in response to shifting power dynamics. Beyond regional concerns, the Geneva outcome had implications for the broader multipolar world order. Major powers like China and Russia were closely monitoring developments, each with distinct objectives and strategies. Beijing appeared focused on consolidating influence while maintaining an image of strategic neutrality, carefully calibrating public commentary to signal restraint and reliability. Moscow, meanwhile, seemed to perceive the collapse as an opportunity to expand its influence, potentially leveraging the deadlock to strengthen regional alliances and assert a more dominant role in shaping outcomes. In this context, the U.S. departure was not simply a tactical maneuver, but part of a broader interplay among global powers competing for leverage and strategic advantage. Trust and credibility remained central to the negotiation challenges. Diplomacy depends as much on unspoken assurances and demonstrated reliability as on the formal text of agreements. In Geneva, decades of past grievances and mistrust had accumulated, complicating the ability of any delegation to negotiate from a position of confidence. For Washington, leaving the table symbolized an insistence on concrete, enforceable commitments. Yet, as analysts emphasized, such moves also signal skepticism, creating a delicate balancing act, asserting one's demands without alienating potential partners or triggering a spiral of mistrust that could stall future engagement indefinitely. The role of timing in this high-stakes environment cannot be overstated. Diplomacy is intimately linked to the domestic political calendar, global events, and economic cycles. U.S. Negotiators, mindful of congressional scrutiny and public opinion, faced tight constraints on how much compromise could be politically viable. Iranian officials, navigating economic sanctions and social unrest, similarly had limited maneuverability. European mediators, operating under the pressure of multiple member states and public accountability, had to carefully weigh every concession. This confluence of timing-related pressures meant that even minor missteps could have disproportionate consequences, amplifying the impact of decisions such as walking away from the negotiation table. Global media coverage further complicated the environment. The speed and intensity of reporting amplified every nuance, shaping both domestic and international perception. In the modern era, public opinion operates as a parallel arena in which diplomatic actions are evaluated, contested, and interpreted. Every gesture, from the timing of departure to the tone of statements, carries symbolic weight. The U.S. exit, therefore, functioned not only as a tactical maneuver within Geneva, but also as a calculated communication to multiple audiences, signaling resolve while inviting scrutiny of other parties' positions. Economic ramifications added another layer of urgency. The Geneva breakdown created immediate market volatility, particularly in sectors connected to energy, defense, and global trade. Analysts projected potential disruptions in supply chains and financial flows, with indirect consequences for investor confidence in international commerce. Economic uncertainty, in turn, feeds back into the diplomatic process. Governments under domestic economic pressure may adopt more rigid positions, seeking to protect national interests, even if it complicates international engagement. In this sense, the collapse of negotiations had both immediate and cascading effects, illustrating the interconnected nature of modern diplomacy. Strategic and security considerations were equally pronounced. Without a clear agreement to establish norms and verification mechanisms, regional powers faced increased uncertainty, which could prompt adjustments in military posture or alliance configurations. Even absent direct confrontation, minor tactical shifts, such as the redeployment of forces, changes in defense budgets, or intelligence posture adjustments, can carry significant signaling weight, influencing both negotiation dynamics and broader strategic calculations. The Geneva deadlock thus functioned as a critical inflection point, highlighting the complex interplay between diplomacy, security planning, and risk management in a volatile regional environment. Despite the seemingly negative outcomes, some diplomats retained cautious optimism. Historical precedents suggest that apparent failures often precede breakthroughs. Informal discussions, back-channel communication, and discreet consultations can create conditions conducive to renewed progress once public attention diminishes and political pressures ease. In this view, the U.S. withdrawal may not signify the end of dialogue, but rather a tactical pause, a recalibration of strategy designed to reset expectations, reassess leverage, and prepare for a more sustainable negotiation trajectory. The Geneva episode also illuminated the fragility of multilateral mechanisms in the face of complex, high-stakes negotiations. Institutions like the United Nations and regional entities such as the European Union play critical roles in providing neutral forums, mediating disputes, and establishing accountability frameworks. Yet, their effectiveness depends on the willingness of parties to engage in good faith and the broader political environment. The walkout revealed both the strengths and limitations of these institutions, emphasizing the need for adaptive strategies, robust engagement, and creative approaches to maintain momentum in negotiations where stakes are exceptionally high. Signaling remained a dominant theme in the post-Geneva analysis. Walking away from talks, while disruptive, conveys a complex message. It asserts priorities, communicates dissatisfaction, and places the onus of re-engagement on other parties. This maneuver, analysts noted, is a form of strategic leverage designed to recalibrate negotiations without resorting to coercive measures. The effectiveness of such signaling depends on timing, perception, and subsequent action. Too aggressive, and it risks escalation. Too restrained, and it may fail to produce the desired recalibration. As observers continued to dissect the situation, a recurring insight emerged. Diplomacy, in the contemporary global context, is a multi-dimensional challenge. Negotiations intersect with domestic politics, international strategy, economic stability, media narratives, and the intricate dynamics of trust. The Geneva walkout exemplified this reality, demonstrating that every decision, whether a concession, a delay, or a tactical withdrawal, carries consequences far beyond the immediate negotiation room. This complexity underscores the necessity of strategic foresight, nuanced understanding, and adaptive diplomacy in navigating high-stakes international engagement. Finally, the long-term implications of Geneva remained uncertain. Would the pause created by the U.S. exit allow for a more considered, productive negotiation process? Or would it harden divisions, entrench mistrust, and prolong stalemate? Analysts highlighted the importance of continued engagement, strategic communication, and patience in addressing these questions. History suggests that high-stakes diplomacy often requires iterative processes, where setbacks are not endpoints, but opportunities for recalibration. In this context, Geneva might represent one chapter in a broader narrative of strategic negotiation, rather than the conclusion of an effort to secure stability, compliance, and mutual understanding among major powers. In conclusion, the fallout from Geneva underscored the intricate balance of forces that define modern diplomacy. The U.S. departure, while dramatic, reflected a complex interplay of strategic objectives, political pressures, and signaling considerations. Regional actors, global powers, and mediating institutions were all forced to reassess positions, evaluate risks, and anticipate the next moves. The incident highlighted the multidimensional nature of negotiation, where economic, military, political, and perceptual factors intertwine to shape outcomes. As the international community looked ahead, Geneva served as a vivid reminder that diplomacy is rarely linear or predictable. It is an evolving process that demands flexibility, foresight, and a constant recalibration of strategy in the face of shifting circumstances. The fallout from Geneva did not end with a dramatic departure of the United States delegation. Rather, it set in motion a series of cascading effects that reverberated through regional and global political landscapes. Analysts quickly noted that the breakdown of talks exposed structural challenges inherent in high-stakes diplomacy. Negotiations, particularly those involving multiple powers with conflicting objectives, are rarely straightforward. They are influenced by domestic politics, historical rivalries, economic pressures, and the subtleties of signaling, factors that can magnify even minor disagreements into significant deadlocks. In this light, Geneva's collapse was a symptom of broader dynamics rather than an isolated failure. For regional actors, the immediate priority was recalibrating strategy. In the Middle East, Iran found itself at the center of intense scrutiny. Internal divisions, including the competing priorities of hardline and moderate factions, shaped Tehran's response. Hardliners perceived the U.S. walkout as validation for a more confrontational approach, arguing that engagement had failed to produce meaningful concessions. Moderates, on the other hand, warned that alienating international partners could exacerbate economic challenges and isolate the country diplomatically. This internal debate influenced not only Tehran's posture in subsequent negotiations, but also its domestic political landscape, as each faction leveraged the Geneva outcome to bolster legitimacy and strategic influence. Neighboring countries reacted with equal urgency. Gulf states, acutely aware of the implications for energy security and regional stability, began assessing contingency plans. Analysts highlighted the fragility of supply chains and the potential for volatility in oil and gas markets, suggesting that even short-term disruptions could have global ramifications. Defense planners also evaluated the impact on military readiness and alliance dynamics, recognizing that uncertainty in one area could compel adjustments elsewhere. This response underscored the interconnectedness of modern geopolitics, where a single negotiation can trigger cascading adjustments across multiple sectors and regions. On the global stage, major powers like China and Russia responded with measured strategic adjustments. Beijing maintained a careful balance, projecting influence while avoiding overtly provocative actions, signaling both reliability and restraint to global audiences. Moscow appeared to interpret the collapse as a potential opportunity, leveraging the deadlock to enhance its regional influence and strengthen strategic alliances. The U.S. withdrawal, in this context, was a significant move in the complex chessboard of multipolar geopolitics, demonstrating how a single tactical decision can shape the strategic considerations of nations across continents. Trust and credibility remained at the heart of the challenges posed by Geneva. Decades of historical grievances and unresolved disputes complicated negotiations, making it difficult for delegations to negotiate with confidence. Washington's insistence on enforceable safeguards underscored the critical importance of reliability and compliance in international agreements. Yet the very act of walking away also reinforced skepticism, creating a delicate equilibrium, asserting one's principles while keeping the door open for future dialogue. Analysts emphasized that in high-stakes diplomacy, perception often carries as much weight as substance, and every gesture is interpreted through multiple lenses. Domestic political pressures exerted a profound influence on Geneva's outcome. In the U.S. dais, negotiators faced intense scrutiny from Congress, political commentators, and the electorate, with debates emerging over the wisdom and consequences of leaving the talks. In Iran, negotiators were constrained by economic pressures, social unrest, and factional politics, limiting their maneuverability and shaping their strategic approach. European mediators were caught between managing member state expectations and sustaining their role as neutral facilitators. The convergence of these domestic factors demonstrates the extent to which international negotiations are intertwined with internal political realities, highlighting the complexity of aligning global strategy with national imperatives. Media coverage amplified the stakes, transforming diplomatic actions into public narratives with far-reaching implications. Every nuance of the Geneva talks, the tone of statements, timing of departure, or facial expressions of negotiators, was scrutinized and interpreted, influencing domestic and international perception. In this context, the U.S. walkout functioned as both a tactical maneuver and a communication tool, signaling firmness and resolve, while generating pressure for recalibration among other parties. The media, in essence, became an auxiliary arena for negotiation, shaping both public sentiment and diplomatic strategy. Economic and strategic considerations were inseparable in assessing the aftermath. The Geneva collapse triggered immediate volatility in global markets, particularly in energy and defense sectors, and prompted reassessments in global trade and investment planning. Countries under economic pressure were more likely to adopt rigid positions, prioritizing national interests over compromise. Security calculations were similarly affected as regional powers considered adjustments to military readiness, intelligence operations, and alliance structures. Even in the absence of direct confrontation, these strategic recalibrations communicated intent and shaped subsequent negotiations, illustrating the multidimensional consequences of diplomatic setbacks. Despite the immediate challenges, historical precedent offered cautious optimism. High-stakes negotiations often follow nonlinear paths, where apparent failures create opportunities for reflection, back-channel consultations, and strategic recalibration. Moments of public collapse can serve to reset expectations, allow parties to assess leverage, and establish conditions for more durable agreements in the future. In this light, the U.S. walkout may have represented a temporary pause, a tactical repositioning designed to strengthen negotiating power without closing the door to renewed engagement. Multilateral institutions played a central role in facilitating ongoing dialogue, even in the face of setbacks. Organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union, serve as forums for negotiation, mediation, and accountability, providing mechanisms that help prevent escalation and maintain dialogue. Yet their effectiveness depends on the willingness of all parties to engage in good faith. Geneva's collapse highlighted both the resilience and limitations of these frameworks, underscoring the need for adaptive strategies and continuous engagement to maintain progress under high-pressure conditions. Strategic signaling emerged as a critical tool in navigating the post-Geneva environment. Walking away from negotiations communicates dissatisfaction, asserts priorities, and transfers the burden of re-engagement. Its effectiveness depends on timing, perception, and subsequent action. Too aggressive, and escalation becomes a risk. Too restrained, and the intended message may fail to influence counterparts. The U.S. departure illustrated the delicate calibration required in high-stakes diplomacy, balancing assertiveness with the potential for continued dialogue. As the dust settled, one overarching lesson became clear. Diplomacy is inherently multidimensional, involving the convergence of domestic politics, global strategy, economic stability, security planning, and public perception. Geneva's events highlighted the intricacy of negotiation in a complex, interconnected world, where every action resonates across multiple domains. The U.S. walkout, far from being a simple failure, demonstrated the strategic interplay between principle, signaling, and leverage that defines contemporary international engagement. In conclusion, the Geneva episode offered a vivid illustration of the challenges, stakes, and opportunities inherent in high-level diplomacy. The U.S. departure was dramatic, but it reflected broader patterns of negotiation shaped by domestic and international imperatives, strategic calculations, and historical context. Regional actors, global powers, and multilateral institutions alike were forced to adapt, reassess, and plan for the next stage. Geneva reminds us that diplomacy is rarely linear. It is a dynamic, iterative process that requires foresight, flexibility, and strategic acumen to navigate successfully. As the world continues to watch, one thing is certain. The stakes remain high, the challenges are complex, and the consequences of every move will reverberate far beyond Geneva. For those following this unfolding story, it is essential to understand that negotiation is not just about agreements. It is about timing, trust, signaling, and the careful management of both perception and substance. The final chapter of Geneva may be unwritten, but its lessons are already clear. Diplomacy demands patience, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to finding paths towards stability in an uncertain world. If you found this breakdown insightful and want to stay updated on global affairs and diplomacy, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell to catch the latest updates, analyses, and deep dives into international events shaping our world. Every click helps us bring more detailed and informative content straight to you. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more in-depth coverage of the events that matter most.